It's great to be here. I can't wait to talk more about this campaign, which is
Practice
really
and
good to.
programming. My intention is to bring my experience as well.
I would have moments where I would just not be okay around people.
As a social worker, I have always wanted to impact people and help.
Some of our young people get trapped in that pipeline at 16.
Has a mental health disorder and or diagnosis, when he or she has an episode, like they're not even conscious.
Too, to see, okay, how are we taking care of these human bodies behind bars?
Let's invest in people and not prisons. Welcome back to the podcast. Today I have the honor and pleasure of introducing you to a colleague of mine, William Eric Waters, also known as Easy. And I couldn't even begin to describe his biography. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Eric and let Eric himself tell us a little bit about himself.
Well, thank you, Mark. And although I do a lot of work within the criminal legal system, I am a writer, first and foremost a poet. And I always feel the need to state that. I'm here in my own capacity today, so I won't speak about the work that I'm currently doing with the international not-for-profit organization that I've worked for the last 8 years, doing a lot of things within the criminal legal system, especially how our young people are impacted by the criminal legal system. And as you know, Mark, that school to prison pipeline is deep and long, and some of our young people get trapped in that pipeline at 16, and they are middle-aged men and women when they emerge from prison.
So Eric, I'm glad you started with the pipeline to prison piece, and I just want you to talk to us a little bit about treatment in non-jails, because I see that you work with some of our young people who are basically being pipelined into, jail and prison. Do you think that jail and prison is a fit for them?
Jail and prison, or jail or prison, is not a fit for anyone, and especially our younger people. And only quite recently, with the efforts of advocates to raise the age, do we no longer treat 16 and 17-year-olds as adults, in quotation marks, for the purposes of criminal punishment.
Speak to that a little bit more, Eric.
Absolutely not, Mark. Prison, it seems, for America, and we've been hearing this the last 20 years, America locks up more people than any other nation in the world. And not only do we, and I identify as we, I'm born and bred American, Brooklynite through and through, we hold people in prison for longer periods of time. And we talk about mass incarceration, and a French sociologist actually says that's not an accurate phrase, because mass incarceration would mean we lock up everybody indiscriminately. And he says it's better to describe it as hyper incarceration, because we lock up, for the most part, Black and brown people, mostly young men.
So Eric, let me ask you this question. In your experience and in your work field, do you think that a person that has a mental health problem or a substance use problem, do you think that prison, by putting them in the prison, we would make the community a safer place?
No, and the person, prisons are designed as total institutions. Prisons are not designed to be rehabilitational centers. And I'll even concede that in the last, say, 20 years, prison pretends not to be a place just of custody and control, because as the former president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Jeremy Travis, said, but they all come back. So ultimately, most people we send to prison and everyone we send to jail, unless, because we know what's been happening on Rikers Island the last couple of years, people go there without even a serious offense, and it becomes a death sentence, and many of them have mental health issues, and many of the mental health issues are undiagnosed. Because when we send people to jails and prisons, we don't have an assessment process that really looks at their state of being, psychologically or physically.
So you're saying, Eric, that we actually are doing more damage to the individual, thereby doing more damage to the community that the individual is going to be released back to?
Yes, and I don't use recidivism as a success metric, because recidivism just says someone has not returned to prison or jail. I could have been in prison or jail, and for the last 3 years, been sleeping and living on the train, not gainfully employed, but I did not return to prison or jail in that 3-year period. And so I'm not a statistic in terms of recidivism. And I think we have to, when we start to talk about what works, we have to, of course, we don't want people returning to prison, and we want to track that, but we don't want to measure it and or use it as a success metric. It's not a success metric simply because someone has not returned to prison.
So what would you define as being a success metric, Eric, for someone who has a mental health diagnosis and or a substance use diagnosis, and the person is homeless?
Mark, you gave me a triple whammy there, right? So we can think in terms of Micah, mentally ill with chemical addiction, even though I don't like that term, but that's how it's understood in the treatment world. And then we add unstable housing in the mix. And I think we can agree that stable housing is the first step where someone can begin to have that mental health issue and or substance abuse issue treated. And we have a serious issue in terms of homelessness in New York City. And we all know, especially born and bred New Yorkers, it's a very expensive town. And when we hear affordable housing, it's not really affordable. And some of the housing is not fit for human habitation. So you have those three really serious things in the mix. And whether it's mental health issue and or substance abuse issues, there has to be a process of stabilization, which I believe begins with housing. If someone is homeless, that person is not going to be treated and not going to get the treatment that he or she needs. I think first and foremost, we really have to look at housing as a stabilizing factor to address both the school to prison pipeline, mental health issues, and or substance use issues.
So Eric, what would you say to the people that says, listen, they committed a crime, they need to be in jail?
And that's the thing, and that's part of the narrative, and that's why, and I'll just use the term mass incarceration, because that's what people understand, even though we should understand it as hyper incarceration. We don't lock up everybody. We, and I want to say a little something about that later. And so we have put forth this narrative, and we put this narrative forward with moral indignation, but they committed a crime. And I don't know if we do that as a society because we know in our heart of hearts that prison is oftentimes the first response, right? Not the final solution. And I think it begins with changing that narrative, right? And you and I, we've been part of conferences where there's a question, can anything good come out of prisons or jail? And the things or the people who have emerged and have transformed their lives, it's not because of the system, but in spite of the system. They find something deep inside themselves. They say to themselves, when they realize the kind of system that they are trapped in, never again. And they do everything in their power, in spite of, but not because of the system, not to return. And many ultimately do work in the social service field to lift other people up and out of those circumstances, whether it's homelessness, substance abuse, not as much with mental health issue, although we have that dual diagnosis of mental health and substance use.
So now, Eric, I also understand and know that you have a background in law. So I want to pose a question to you that I've been posing to quite a few people. Does a judge and or a district attorney have the ability and credentials to diagnose people who are standing in front of them that have been accused of committing a crime?
No, and that's not what they're there for. We have a criminal legal system, and I intentionally say it's a legal system, not a justice system. We have a criminal legal system which is adversarial in nature. And whenever you hear either a judge or a prosecutor brag about his or her conviction rate, you know something is seriously wrong in that courtroom, something is seriously wrong in that district attorney's office. Judges are supposed to be impartial referees. District attorneys are supposed to see that justice is done, not that they win a case. Because sometimes if the case cannot be proven, and oftentimes, you know, we talk about a presumption of innocence in our criminal legal system, but it's more so a presumption of guilt. And even when someone is found not guilty, unless someone is exonerated and there's evidence that this person is truly innocent, we don't say that people are innocent. We say they are guilty or not guilty. When we say not guilty, we just say there was not enough legal proof to prove their guilt. And so we walk into, meaning both prosecutors, judges, and oftentimes defense counsel, with this presumption of guilt of the people, well, the most important people in this process, because nothing happens if that person is not accused of a crime. So if we were writing this as a play, the main character would be the person charged with the crime. But definitely judges and prosecutors, they're not trained to diagnose, they're not trained to deal with people who have mental health and substance use issues, and they don't even have the questions to take a small dive into what might have brought this person before them and what might be solutions, as opposed to just the punitive nature of our criminal legal system.
So Eric, you know, let's go in New York right now. I mean, like, people are afraid to ride the train because, you know, these people keep going in and out of jail and they keep committing these same offenses. What would you say to those people, Eric?
Well, I'm a native New Yorker, and just yesterday I was taking the C train to go to downtown Brooklyn. And when I went down the stairs and I'm on the platform, literally everyone was lined up against the wall. So people have in their minds that public transportation is not safe. And I won't argue with that because of what we currently see. But I also think that the media takes hold of something and focuses on it, and we think more of something is happening where it might be just more of it is being reported. And I remember when there was the narrative about the so-called super predator, and this idea of a super predator, it was all about the school to prison pipeline. These politicians were looking at young men of color, saying that they were going to turn into, look, they're not even using humanizing language. They're saying predators, like they're nothing more than animals. And for a 20-year period, crimes committed by young people remained relatively stable. There was no big increase, nor was there a big dip. So I question, because I ride public transportation, I don't want to see the madness that's brought to us by the news happen seemingly day after day after day. But I think the media is focusing on it. Politicians are grabbing onto that. And no one, I think, is proposing solutions to a problem that they identify. And we know at one time, the so-called solution was just a mantra, right? More police, more prisons, longer prison terms. And I have seen more and more police officers in public transportation the last week. Does it make me feel safer? I just hope that it serves as a deterrent to someone who is going to commit a crime. But I think if someone has a serious mental health issue, it doesn't matter how many police officers are on the platform, they will act out.
And when they act out, there's some that say, well, when they act out, let's lock them up, let's put them in prison.
Let's lock them up and throw away the key.
Is that possible?
To lock people up and throw away the key?
Yeah, that has a mental health disorder and
no,
they haven't committed an A1 felony.
No, they will ultimately return, probably worse off because of the experience of imprisonment. Imprisonment is not a panacea. It's not a cure. It's about isolation, right? We lock people up as a form of retribution in our adversarial system. And, even though rehabilitation is stated as one of the penological goals of imprisonment, that's at the end of the list of the so-called legitimate penological goals. Deterrence, isolation, retribution, rehabilitation always comes last. But I wanted to just state something, Mark. Today is October 27th, 2022. On October 27th, 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. And this law significantly increased disparities in sentences imposed in the federal courts for crimes involving powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, with mandatory minimum sentences. A lot of people look at this as something that jump-started mass incarceration. And it created a disparity of 100 to 1. That ratio was 100 to 1. So, for example, a drug crime involving 5 grams of crack cocaine resulted in a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison, while crimes involving up to 500 grams of powder cocaine received a lower sentencing recommendation. And crack was ultimately identified with people of color and powder cocaine with white people. But this disparity based on whether it was crack cocaine or powder cocaine, there was no credible scientific evidence about anything that was different, the biological impact on people between cocaine and powder versus crack form, but it clearly had racial results. So with the enactment of this law, and we're talking it was enacted federally, so Black people sent to federal prison ballooned from approximately 50 and 100,000 adults, listen to this number, Mark, to 250 for every 100,000 adults. And that's just for Black people. But during the same period, there was almost no change in the number of white people incarcerated in federal prison. And anyone who opens his or her eyes and reads the fine print, in total numbers, more white people use and abuse drugs than people of color. But we know that when we look at this criminal legal system, at each and every stage, people of color are treated differently than white people. You have the same amount of people, Black and white, enter the system at the arrest stage, and by the time you get to prison, the white people accused of the very same crime will find alternatives to incarceration, and or if they are sentenced, it would be much less than people of color.
Okay, so Eric, I got one more question. Does prison deter crime for a person that has a mental health diagnosis or a person that has a substance use diagnosis?
I would say no, and more so with someone who has a mental health issue. And substance use can be so psychologically debilitating, and people can be so psychologically dependent upon using substances that they will do almost anything to get high, including committing crimes. And anyone who lived through the 80s know that, some people were doing almost anything for some crack.
So locking those people up who are out here committing these crimes, to feed their drug habit, or people that have a mental health diagnosis, does that make the community a safer place when we have them locked up?
No, I think it's the illusion from politicians and law enforcement. We peddled this illusion that by locking more people up, we'll be safer. But I beg to differ with that, especially because people return and they're not, for the most part, better because of the experience, because they are not receiving treatment. Prison is not designed for treatment. Prison is designed for custody and control, even if we now pay lip service to the fact that, okay, they are ultimately going to be released and we have to provide reentry services. But reentry services don't speak to what really needs to happen. And that's reintegrating people into society. And my position is reentry is just the moment of return. So as soon as someone walks through jail or prison gates, they have returned. Reentry has begun and ended. Now it's this process of getting their life together and reintegrating back into society. And I won't say integrating because people will play with semantic. Oh, someone can't be rehabilitated because they were not rehabilitated in the first place. And that's almost like saying someone was born a criminal. And I've heard people, even people who have been incarcerated, use those semantics. And that's buying into the narrative that's set by people who would keep you locked up. And so we have to always look at the narrative, who's pushing that narrative, and we have to be really careful that we just don't get on the bandwagon. For example, people say mass incarceration, and it's not mass incarceration, it's hyper incarceration, because people of color are disproportionately in prison, period. When we look at drug offenses, more white people are getting high than Black people. But who's locked up? Who's most impacted by being arrested for drug use? People of color. So we have to be very careful. One, we have to know the origin story of the narrative. Where did it start? And just think of the super predator, right? Sometimes we have these ideas come out of think tanks and they have agendas. It's not factual, it's based on an agenda.
So, Eric, my last question to you: what could our listeners do to help make the public a safer place when it comes to placing people in prison and jails and then bringing them out? What could we do differently to make the public a safer place, especially for those who, you know, have a mental health diagnosis that hasn't been diagnosed, and those that have a substance use disorder that hasn't been, you know, treated, exposed, and you know, people just hid it for years and years and years. What could we do to make our community a safer place, knowing that, you know, we're going to lock these people up and they're going to come back out?
Well, locking people up is a knee-jerk response, right? And I know from all of the work that I've done in the criminal legal system, we really don't ask the question why, right? Why did someone do whatever he or she did? So I think part of it is we have to become educated. We need politicians to be more responsible as opposed to promoting an agenda to really look at the root cause of things. We don't look at the root cause of things. And a lot of it is just based on the American psyche, right? With rugged individualism, right? If you don't achieve whatever you achieve in America, it's your fault. It's not systemic stuff. So we have to look more critically at our society. And it's always mind-boggling to me because this nation was formed on the basis of a revolution. And we are, as Americans, like really anti-revolutionary. And I believe it was Thomas Jefferson said that almost every generation needs to start a revolution. We can't get complacent. I think many people are complacent. Many people are not educated about issues. So part of it would be to become educated about these issues. And another part of it is, and I love New York City, it's this great diverse city, but it's also a tale of two cities. We have luxury condos, and you walk across the street, we have public housing. We have great disparities in wealth. We have, even in our public school system, segregation, and probably the most segregated place in our society is prison. And we need to be able to look in the mirror. And it always drives me crazy when something tragic happens in America. And for the most part, white politicians and white people would say, you know, we are better than that. And that's not America. And black people just have a different experience of America. No, this is America. And other people of color, whether we're talking about the Japanese, when they were interned, Japanese Americans interned in concentration camps, we call them relocation centers during World War II. Asians have also suffered under various discriminatory laws in America. Jewish people also have. So we have to, I think, be more honest. We lie to ourselves as Americans, right? We're just this great nation. And I believe that, and I know this is a little sidebar, but America is great because black people have forced America to look at herself and look at those ideals that she professes and attempts to export all over the world. And it came, and we got to a point where the international community started to just point their finger back at America. You're not doing what you profess to do. You're not living up to those ideals. So I just finally wanted to say, right, we live in a society where we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To take someone's liberty in this context of America, it's like the harshest punishment in a society that values liberty. And people think that, and I remember Warren Burger, former chief judge of the United States Supreme Court, he said, people who think that prison is a country club have told you two things about themselves. One, they have never been a member of a country club, and two, they have never been in prison. Prisons are not country clubs. Like, and there's this narrative, right? People say, oh, they have three hots in the car. So what are we supposed to do? Put people in prison and don't feed them, let them starve to death? So we have to start to challenge these sacred cows, these beliefs about our criminal legal system, these beliefs about our political system, and we just have to like look in the mirror and just be honest. And I think there's a dearth of honesty in the American media, in the American psyche, and definitely from our American politicians.
So how could we make our communities a safer space, Eric?
Well, one, we have to look at people who have done harm not as the other. They're our brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, and we have to find ways, but not just find ways because there are ways, but we have to be willing to do the work to address these ills and not think that we could lock people up and we have provided a solution for the ills of society. So it's one of those things where even when we talk about the criminal legal system, its very foundation, can it even be reformed, right? Or are we just tinkering with a system that's not designed to administer justice? It's a legal system. So it takes a willingness of all of us, regardless of race, creed, or color, background, to be really honest. And I think we are not honest, and especially when we talk about the racial divide in this country, we have never, and I say we don't even have the language to talk about certain things because there's an unwillingness to talk about certain things, and we try to push things off as if they are in the past. And you follow me on social media, Mark, and I'm always saying, lest we forget. And most of this stuff happened in our lifetime. So for me, it's not the distant past. For me, it's my life, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So we have to be willing to not push things away and try to push them in the past as if these things are not happening now. So we have this unwillingness to act because we think it's not systems, that it's just some people. And even in the Black community, we'll say it's just that group of people. But society writ large doesn't just look at that group. They look at, unfortunately, like all Black people are judged by the act of one Black person. And that narrative is pushed and promoted not just in America, but internationally.
So to make our communities safer, Eric, I want to thank you for really informing our listeners that we need to one be more actively involved in what's going on in the community.
Yes.
Two, we need to be more actively engaged in ensuring that people who need treatment need to receive it. And
Yes.
three, we need to, we can't have the tale of two cities, like a rich part on one side of the street and a poor part on the other side of the street. And, like we got on one side of the street, filet mignon, and then on the other side of the street we got bones, and we think that the two are not going to have an impact on the entire community, and it does. And when we look at mental health and substance use and crime, like I really love and appreciate you talking about a person that has, which I think as a community, we have yet to come to terms with this. An individual that has a mental health disorder and or diagnosis, when he or she has an episode, like they're not even conscious of the police. So the police is not going to, deter that. They have to receive treatment. A person that is under, the influence of a substance, and I want to go to a legal one, alcohol. Some people, when they get drunk, the police and nobody around them, really holds any authority because they're not in their proper frame of mind.
Right.
And when they're not in their proper frame of mind, I think we do ourselves as a community, the family of that particular individual, and, every party that's involved in it a disservice when we lock them up. And in some instances, we don't lock them up. We do, the unfathomable. And again, I love the piece that you talked about in terms of, life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness. And when you take away that liberty, when we confine someone in a prison cell or a jail cell that has a mental health diagnosis, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed, a person with a substance use issue, whether they're diagnosed with it or undiagnosed with it, and we confine them, we have done a disservice to our community. And what I purport is that not only have we done a disservice to our community, we have created a hostile, volatile environment in our community, because inevitably people are going to be released unless they have committed an A1 felony. And when they come out worse than they went in, because there's no treatment. And we need to get treatment and not jails. Treatment and not jails is what is going to really address this public health crisis that we have in not only New York City, New York State, but in the United States. And I want to thank you, Eric, for taking the opportunity to share your thoughts, to give us some historical perspectives, some perspectives on race, the dynamic of race, and all these other things and how they play into our criminal legal system.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
You're welcome.